Hello, I'm Gene Policinski, and I'm president of the Freedom Forum Institute. And I want to welcome you to the latest in a series of town hall meetings being sponsored by the Freedom Forum Institute around the United States to really explore the issue with people who are both in and outside of the First Amendment community on the future of free speech and freedom of the press, two of the more pressing issues of our time, we think. And we're joined today by faculty members and students from Ball State University, more particularly the College of Communications and Information and Media, CCIM, and we're coming to you from those studios here at Ball State. And so what I hope to do is open up a discussion with the faculty members we have here and get their views first on the future of free speech. So if we could start over here and ask also if you would let us know your name and sort of the context from which you will be speaking. Thank you.
I'm Dom Caristi. I teach in the Telecommunications department at Ball State. And my perspective on the state of the First Amendment, the future, is that it keeps moving. It's a moving target. And if you look back historically, free speech has been more and more threatened in those times when government officials are scared. War times, times when during the Red Scare, when government felt threatened. And it always appears that government attempts to clamp down on free expression are strongest at those points. Then the pushback comes and the free expression returns to what I would like to think of as its normal state.
Very good.
Hi, I'm Natalie Seeley. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Journalism, and I teach media law. So I'm going to say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of free speech, but I think we really need to focus on educating our young people about free speech. There are so many misunderstandings. Most Americans can't even name our 5 freedoms. Most students don't know that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. So I think that education should be our goal, and I think if we can do that, then we'll be in a stronger position.
I'm Phil Bremen. I am an emeritus faculty member here at Ball State. Most of my career I was on television locally and on network, covering the news as a reporter or occasionally as an anchor. My thought about free speech is that the First Amendment, a guarantee of freedom of speech, restricts only government. Private institutions and private individuals can say whatever they want. And if you want to have free speech, then you ought to give me free speech too. There's no room in that for not being offended. There's no law, there's no constitutional guarantee that your feelings won't be hurt. Contrarily though, or on the other hand, I think it's important to note that just because the law permits us to say whatever we want and face the consequences afterward if need be, that doesn't mean we should. We ought to exercise some self-restraint, some civility, courtesy toward others, and I'm not seeing a lot of that these days.
Mm-hmm. I'm Maria Williams Hawkins. I'm also a telecommunications professor. My thoughts on freedom of speech relate to the fact that I live in a democracy, and I hope that I'm always going to have the right to say what I need to say. In these days, my concern is not so much our losing freedom of speech as our not restraining ourselves from knowing what to say when, and not beating people up with our freedom to say what we may believe. For some people, I think freedom of speech is not as free as it should be in their minds, and for others, it seems a little too free.
Hi, I'm Stan Sollers. I teach in the Department of Telecommunications. I teach audio production, but I also do the news on our public radio station, Indiana Public Radio, do morning edition from 5 to 9 in the morning. And so 20 hours a week, I'm in the trenches. And about free speech, I'm optimistic about its future. What I am concerned most about right now is free listening. And how much people in the audience, and that includes myself, are paying attention to what's going on the federal government level, schools, local government, taxes, roads. Are we just, as we would say in television, punching up network and taking the feed, or are we actually listening with discernment as to what is being said to us and to ask the basic question, which we teach our students, even in audio class, says who? Who said that? And what's the context? So free speech, absolutely. We all want that freedom. We need to defend it and to learn again and again what that First Amendment means, but also to know that free listening exists, and we would not have free listening without free speech.
My name is Beth Messner. I'm an associate professor of communication studies. The courses that I teach mostly relate to the study of rhetoric, or how we use persuasive messages to influence others. Like my colleagues here, I have some degree of optimism. I also have some concerns. I view the freedom of speech as essential, as lifeblood to the democratic process. I believe that when we find constraints placed upon our freedom of speech, that strangles our conversations about important ideas, and that prevents us from engaging in really meaningful dialogue about those important ideas. I certainly find myself concerned about the tendency of some folks to take those rights, the right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, for granted. I find myself highly alarmed by those who seem to be so willing to give up those rights. And I also think that there's a great deal of personal responsibility that we need to be educated about and take upon ourselves when we engage in those dialogues, those conversations. I'm also very grateful for organizations like the ACLU that spend a great deal of time and resources serving as conservators and guardians and protectors of those rights to free speech.
You know, I think it's fair to say much of the last 100 years, the First Amendment and the application of free speech law was really protecting an individual's right to do something, to speak out, to have an unpopular political view, or to, say the F word, or have it on your jacket, and or on a T-shirt about a political figure. Protecting the individual's right against government, restraining them from speaking out. We're seeing the doctrine now, and some of you touched on it in a different way, of too much freedom. We're beginning to see the evolution of almost a freedom from, that there's an obligation to restrain speech that goes beyond making me uncomfortable, but which may challenge my core beliefs, or which may be, I think in the most new doctrine, too dangerous for a society to hear. And some of that's related to technology, where the speed of speech and the pervasiveness of it and the perpetual presence of it online sort of elevates dangerous ideas to this idea that there are some just too dangerous to hear. How do you react if you see that, or if you don't? What about that theory that there are just some ideas that now, thanks to technology, maybe, just too dangerous to hear? And let me open that up in no particular order to someone who might want to speak.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I certainly defer to Beth to start this because of her study of hate speech.
Yeah.
I certainly understand the concerns about speed of dissemination. I understand the concerns about the way that certain speech, particularly highly provocative speech, can be so emotionally, there's so much emotional provocative baggage associated with it that it does provoke people to respond without thinking and thinking critically. I think particularly when we find ourselves in those kinds of emotional responses, we neglect to ask the kinds of questions that Stan asked earlier about who says, where does this come from? But I don't know that those concerns in and of themselves are dangerous enough from my perspective to say that we need to wholesalely curtail, put restrictions on that kind of speech. I think that robs us of our responsibility as citizens. It robs us of our right to be able to respond in ways that that enable us to exchange ideas in that larger marketplace. And frankly, I'm very concerned about people assuming that they know what too dangerous is. My chief concern is what provides somebody with the power, what enables somebody, what authorizes someone with the power to make those kinds of determinations on behalf of the citizenry whose right to speak and assemble and critique has just been taken from them.
Don?
Yeah, I think that you preface this with, are there ideas that are too dangerous? I take a very extreme position. No, ideas aren't dangerous. The courts have made a big distinction between speech and action.
Sure.
And ideas are what we want to have a conversation about. If we use the old saw of the marketplace of ideas, what we really want in the marketplace is a conversation about ideas. But understanding that not all speech, or not all words are speech. You know, if you go with the old example, shouting fire in a crowded movie theater is not protected. Well, part of the reason it's not protected is because that's not speech. It's not expression as much as it is an action. It's incitement of panic. And just like we can have laws, we protect free expression, but we have laws against harassment. We protect free expression, but it's still a federal crime to threaten the life of the President of the United States. There are limits, of course. Yeah. No constitutional right is an absolute. There is not. And so I think we need to always come back to that distinction between speech and action and attempt to protect those ideas while not necessarily protecting behaviors that go beyond idea.
I think it's also important to realize that hate speech is not the real problem. The underlying problem is the hate itself and the prejudice itself. So when we censor hate speech, we're not really doing anything to counter the actual underlying problems. So rather than censor hate speech, we should be confronting it and countering it rather than, you know, pushing it under the rug.
With freedom of speech.
Right.
I don't have an answer to the question, but I have a concern. In fact, I have two. I was a foreign correspondent in Germany for a while, and the law in Germany says you can be prosecuted for denying that the Holocaust occurred. This is because of Germany's history with Nazism. And I think there may be some things in America's past that we need to own up to and say, because of our role in oppressing various groups in the past, perhaps we need to walk more tenderly. I have a difficulty with who makes the determination, just as Beth suggested. My other concern is this. The marketplace of ideas concept is that the better argument wins out. That was before the internet. That was before bots could flood the internet with all sorts of bogus and often inflammatory material.
Some would even throw in Citizens United, saying that the cash ability to express oneself, the financial ability to seize the marketplace.
I was going to say that too, because I'm with Dom, but I don't think that's speech. I think that's action. When you give $1 million to a candidate, that's not speech, that's action. But I digress. With regard to how do we handle the uneven playing field that we now find ourselves with. It used to be the freedom of the press was for whoever could afford a press, right? And that limited it right away. We haven't got into freedom of the press yet, but you get the idea. But now there are so many different ways for people to tilt the table to unfair advantage, and often with really adverse results, as we've seen all across the Western world. And I don't know what to do about that, but I think we ought to be thinking about it.
Let me give you the most complicated circumstance I've run into when you talk about the marketplace of ideas and suppressing ideas. And it's on a subject that's, you know, difficult in a moment to talk about, and that's child pornography. Now, you know, if there is an area of, if you want to call it expression or speech, that's an area that our society has traditionally said is absolutely unprotected and is totally criminalized. But if we look at how the law actually regulates it, it's not a First Amendment question. The concept is we regulate it under child protection, that no child can be engaged in that, shown that, or that it induces behavior. It is harmful to a child. And we actually regulate it under child protection. we've never had to regulate it under First Amendment because that was just the stopper. It stopped there. You could prosecute them because inherently it is violative of the child. Technology has now made it possible to create avatars or to change an adult into a young child. And again, I'm sorry to, this is a distasteful subject, but it's a perplexing one, because what you have done is then remove the grounds, because no child is actually involved in that. You have removed essentially the legal groundwork on which we regulate it. And you are now down to the pure idea of it. And there was a case in Ohio. It's coming up a little bit now, as the technology allows these images to become much more realistic and lifelike, where it is almost impossible to distinguish whether a child or not is involved. But let's just say we understand that no child was involved in the production of that, and that it's purely an idea that society, I think, obviously clearly has rejected. But our way of addressing it was harmful to children. Should adults be prescribed from that idea, or would that be protected by freedom of speech or expression? And it's a thorny issue, because we've taken it out of the real world and moved it into the realm of the marketplace of ideas, even if it's a repugnant idea. How do we deal with that?
I would use Natalie's framework of earlier. With hate speech, the speech is not the problem, it's what's underlying it. And I would say the same thing in this case. The mindset of someone who would be attracted to content like that needs to be examined. This may be out of the purview of the question of the free expression, free speech, but maybe it's a mental health issue that needs to be addressed, rather than a question of watching these images. I think you use a good example of separating the action from the speech, the idea. And so no children are being harmed in that, but who's attracted to that? We have great works of literature. Romeo and Juliet's about minors. Lolita's about minors. You certainly wouldn't, if Shakespeare were here today, you wouldn't prosecute him for child pornography, for a great work of literature. But, on the other hand, do you want somebody making a graphic video depiction of that? And the question becomes, those people.
It does open to me the door of regulating ideas, but again, we make judgment calls on the extent to which rights apply all the time. I just worry that a repugnant idea, well, what happens to a politically repugnant idea? Is that suddenly going to have sort of the same standing of action? When suffragettes were protesting, many suffragettes were actually sent to mental institutions under the theory of, well, there has to be something wrong with you if you don't want men to protect you, because you've lived this ideal life where you don't have any worries in your pretty little head. Men are out there to protect you, and it's aberrant for you to think that. And women were actually incarcerated and treated for mental illness as a result. So again, I'm deliberately making an extreme, but it's happened before in our society where we actually have criminalized an idea for a period of time.
And then come to realize that was a good idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It goes back to the intent of the action.
Okay.
Or perhaps the intent of the speech, and again, that gets into the gray area he was talking about. But that applies to the example that you brought up, Gene, and to everything here. In fact, with libel, getting over to journalism for a moment, the state of mind of the reporter is one of the qualifiers, as we know. So what's the intent involved? And so I would like to think that the courts could help us sort that out. But in the communications professions, we have to start sorting that. What's our intent?
Right. And when we think about hate speech, often we think about that in conjunction with hate crime. And we use hate speech as a factor to determine whether or not a hate crime has occurred. We use that speech to attest to somebody's motive in instances like that.
Gene, may an occasional journalism professor, always minister, make a comment?
Of course.
So,
no, and actually, and truthfully, in truth, and as we move later to the students who are with us, I mean, the point here is to air a variety of views. And this panel and myself are advocates for free speech. We also have to recognize there are people who would say, you know, we're way off to the edge of what ought to be acceptable, but we also want to get a variety of views as we go around in the town hall. So please, as in any of those roles, or all of them, please take the floor.
Okay. I'll just say, you know, when Beth brought up hate speech, that always clicks up the minister side of me, because there are things that ministers say, especially Christian ministers based on the Bible, that end up being attributed to hate speech. And because of technology, and everybody's either on the internet or being broadcast or on somebody's podcast, occasionally we are charged. You know, a while back they'd say, oh, well, that's religious programming, it won't count. But that seems to be shifting slowly to it was broadcast, it was telecast, it was podcast, so you should have followed the rules. And so that's one of the areas where I get concerned. At what point are we permitted to just say this is what we believe based on this? And I don't mind if you disagree with me, but this is my position.
Well, if I may, and I'm not stating your position here, but I know very often one of the issues that comes to us is that there are faiths that have different views on, you name the controversial subject, abortion, gay rights, women's rights, you know, in some cultures around the world. What is the extent of that? And again, these are concepts and ideas, but I do worry that we are moving into this period where the law is behind it, you know, and what is incitement, and which is one of the actions that you can be prosecuted for from what you say, that we're shifting those boundaries away from permitting pastors to speak from the pulpit, or permitting social activists who might hold, if you say minority views, that distorts it, views that are not held by a large segment of our society, that we're beginning to say, you know what, that's just a 1% of our society, or you know, and we just don't need to hear that. And sometimes it's very hateful. I think we worry also about the ability of people, because of the pervasiveness of the web, and again, this could be just our generation. Maybe people, as I was saying with some classes here, 9 years after Gutenberg published the book, say, well, oh my God, we're inundated with information and it's twisting all of our culture around. So maybe the web isn't as impactful as I think of it, but there are people who argue, again, the speed, pervasiveness, and perpetual nature of web comments make speech that was hateful, that we would say is tolerable in the past, is no longer tolerable. That is, you know, you can give a speech in Washington, D.C. that would reach 1,500 or 3,000 or 100,000. Today reaches the planet in a minute. And it's so impactful that it's distorting, and we cannot permit that. You know, there are people who are making that argument. Technology has changed the very nature of the protection of speech.
If I might offer, I think one of the other challenges here is the technology changes far more quickly than our judicial system can keep up.
Yeah.
And so when we're faced with these special challenges and we have these questions about legality, the courts move so slowly, and for a very good reason.
We almost
the
want them to,
deliberation is, but it creates a kind of distance that that can be very problematic. You know?
Well, defamation was predicated on sort of a limited amount of distribution, that you could run a correction and reach that audience presumably in mass, that you could define damages because it was a specific incident, that you could remedy at some point by compensation to the person if they were unfairly defamed. Defamation today is perpetual, eternal, and instant. And I don't think the law has even begun to address that. But does anybody want to react to that idea? I mean, what about defamation? What about our right to say something bad about somebody? Have we just gone over the top now and we shouldn't be so impolite? We've always said free speech lets us be insulting. But is that still true?
Well, I remember what David Brinkley, a former NBC and later ABC news anchor and host of This Week, said one time when he was interviewed by Dick Cavett. He said, and I'll spare you from my impression of David Brinkley.
He had a very distinctive delivery.
Yes. He said, I frequently hear from people who say, you're biased and I disagree with you. Never once have I heard from somebody in the audience who said, "You're biased, and I agree with you."
Yeah. Well, that was actually not a bad impression.
Yeah.
You've caught the cadence of
Yeah, but I guess it gets to the point that with all of this, the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. That is the subject matter. Yeah, like you said, instantaneously,
Yeah.
the news is all over the planet. It's as though the congregants are now the episcopacy. We all have our own computers, our own presses, so to speak, and there's so much noise, semantic noise out there to try to sort this out. It's like, who's on first?
Yeah.
And I think that's really our challenge right there. And in terms of defamation, all bets are off. How do you sue somebody with an anonymous IP address?
Yeah.
You can't even find them. How do you defend yourself?
Yeah.
Those goalposts have moved.
Yeah.
And how do you attempt to provide compensation for that defamation when
Yeah.
we find our voices are so siloed and we communicate in echo chambers? So an attempt to try to redress an instance of defamation can hardly get through those silo walls.
I'll be the discordant voice.
Uh-oh, here we are.
Yeah. So what do I care if my reputation has been destroyed in Kuala Lumpur? Last time I checked, I don't have much of a following there. I mean, we protect people from defamation because of the impact that it has on their life. So we try to compensate for if my wife leaves me because somebody falsely accused me of something, or if I lose my job because someone falsely accused me of something.
You
And
lose an
that's-
election because of...
Right. there should be.
I should bring that up. Yes.
There should be a way to try to put
Yeah.
a dollar amount on that. Now, I mean, this gets into the silliness of our legal system in that we have to put dollar amounts on, like when someone loses a limb or dies in
Right,
an
yeah.
accident. It's not an easy thing to do. But I still think the system of saying that falsely making people believe that someone has done something that they haven't, that damages their reputation, should be compensated. And it's only in as much as it's harmed me. I say the fact that it can be delivered globally really is irrelevant to me.
Tom, I think you still have a problem in Guam, but I think you're okay in Guam.
Kuala Lumpur, you're safe.
But
Maybe,
the difference a lot of times with these issues would be the method of distribution. I mean, the wrong is done whether it's done in a personal letter, because you can libel somebody in a personal letter. Just one copy goes out. Or it's a national broadcast or whatever.
Or a Facebook post.
Or a Facebook post. And this is where, for instance, in broadcast, in print journalism, the traditional pillars right there, if you will, we've got mass communication, which it's easy to imagine that with broadcasting. Point-to-point communication, it's easy to conjure that image up with telephone conversations, because that is considered point-to-point. Now, what is the web? Is that mass or is that point-to-point? And whatever it is, what is then the point? The laws still apply, but yet I still hear occasional students who will say, well, I can put this song that's not my property out there. No, that's not your property. What about copyright? Well, it's on the web, but on broadcasting you can't do that. Oh, what's the difference? You're still disseminating it. You could still very much get sued by a record company or by whomever or by an author, chapter out of a book. I mean, all of these issues are swirling around right here. And it has to do sometimes with the media. But again, it goes back to the central question. What was behind the intent? What were you wanting to do with this?
Or not caring if you did. If it's
Or not
negligence,
caring.
right?
Exactly.
If it's a negligence, you don't care if it was true or not. You just did.
Yep.
Well, let me say it's not so much whether your reputation in Kuala Lumpur has been damaged, but the fact that 10 years from now, if you've successfully sued someone who defamed you improperly and wrongly, and you've been compensated, that there's a website in Kuala Lumpur which repeats the original libel. And
Okay, so that brings up another interesting contrast between Europe and the U.S. and the right to
Right,
be forgotten,
Yes.
right? So in Europe, which in some regards is way out there in regulating the web in ways that we are not, they have come up with this scheme that has been termed the right to be forgotten, where the web page never goes away, but the search engine has to break those links. If you're looking for information about me 10 years from now, and I'm not running for public office, and I'm not considered to be a celebrity, then I can say, I don't want people to find this embarrassing bit of information about me. And those, even if it's true, if those search engines are not, if those search engines are located in Europe, provide services in Europe. As an example, there was a case successfully argued by someone in Spain, and those links are broken in Spain and throughout the EU, but we can search it here, and we can still find it.
Well, again, by extension, you know, because I think you might be able to make that argument for embarrassing information as a private individual. First of all, what about a public figure? Do we need to know that information and not want to extend that right to, and then what's a public figure? But also, again, when we say that there is embarrassing information about an individual, to me that opens that door, and maybe in your view it doesn't, but I worry that it says that individual who maybe delivers a hateful anti-Semitic address, that by some decision, either by the third-party provider, Google or somebody, or by legislation, at some moment we've made a decision in our society that anti-Semitic attacks are inappropriate or illegal, that whole spectrum. And therefore it's okay to hide that link and take that off the web, because, you know, in our society we don't tolerate anti-Semitism anymore. We respect all faiths, and particularly, you know, not allowing you to target Jewish people, historically the target of many attacks. That's damaging to our, I'm going to make that argument, it's damaging to our society. And there's no real value in our society to hearing yet another repetition of an argument that's been advanced over many, many years. You can search that in history. We just don't want to have somebody saying it now at this moment, because you can look up anti-Semitism and find out what people have said. We just don't want that one right now, because that just continues it. So I want that right to be forgotten is the right to ignore. And could they be applied? I mean, I worry that the famed slippery slope. What justifies something will suddenly become justification for something we did not intend.
There's another level to that. If I want to know what it is that this public figure said that was so distasteful that it's being called racist, for instance, I may have trouble finding it just because nobody wants to publish it, because it's that disgusting. But absent the facts, how do I decide how bad it was?
Right, right. And often that is now with the right to publish photos, or the maybe it's not the right, but the obligation to publish photos from conflict zones and terrorist attacks. There was recently a bombing, I think in France, in which people showed very graphic images of and it was video of the actual explosion, which we don't often get. And then there were some graphic images possibly shown, and certainly on the web available, of the injuries. And people said, that somehow glorifies or expands the purpose of the terrorist attack. And yet other people said, you know, no, you have to see how horrific that was to understand how unacceptable on a moral level that kind of attack was.
And another group of people will say, that's upsetting, I don't want to see it.
And, right, and there's other people just say, over my breakfast, post toasties, I don't want to see it. And it's benign sort of, you know, neglect.
But I think that provides an opportunity for us to make choices. Choices as individuals, whether or not we want to consume those messages. Choices on the part of news organization, what fits their ethical code. But should the choice be given to our government to restrict the dissemination of that information?
I mean, every small newspaper in America used to run accident photos. And then when we began to get color into those papers, editors all across the country, without an edict from the government or even from many times journalism organizations, said, we're no longer going to publish that, because there's suddenly what was a little gray blob over there in the corner is no longer gray, and that's pretty gory. And those pictures disappeared from the front pages of a lot of newspapers.
Gene, but
Yeah.
I wonder today if instead of saying we're not going to post that in our newspaper, we'll have a message, please go to our website where you can see more specific images, because the technology now allows us to be good in the front and whatever we want to be in our other options.
Well, and that is something people have done with terrorist images.
Yeah.
And with often, what comes to mind was the horrible beheadings
Yes.
that went on with 2 American journalists about 3 years ago now. And there were some images that you could see of that, again, in that very manner. Also, it came up in the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, where in Europe, those images were published at times because people thought they were of themselves worthy. Other times it was to do one of those to government regulations about blasphemy and saying, you can't stop me from printing it. Only 2 papers I'm aware of in the United States published those images. Some hid them behind you can go here if you want, but 2 papers, Philadelphia Inquirer and I think a student paper, maybe at Cornell, published those. I'm not sure about Cornell. A student paper published them just as they would run of edition. I'm not aware of any television network or stations which actually showed them, or if they did it, they were heavily censored so as to not offend.
Well, if you take a look at that or the car wreck example or whatever, there's a certain amount of advertiser pressure, certainly in television, that may not be apparent in the newsroom, but it might trickle down to news management from up above in the overall management of the network. Likewise with newspapers trying to hold on, and then we have that traditional persona of our news organization, be it radio, television, or print, and now we have this second reality, like you mentioned, which is the web, where we can be a bit more open exposure, if you will, on such things. So are we being honest with the audience that way, or what are we doing?
Well, the other dimension to that is if you are the publisher, the broadcaster, the faculty who look at the Muhammad cartoons, for instance, and say, we really ought to talk about this. This is an issue, let's expose it. Then the next question is, can you do that without showing them? And if showing them causes some fringe group to act out in violence and hurt people, aren't you partially responsible, at least partially responsible for that? And that's a really tough call.
Yeah, and very few editors would consciously say, I don't care if that offends a large segment of my group, or a small segment of, I just don't care about you. They might have a different argument saying we need to see it. But could you describe those?
Yeah,
and still have in words and still have the same debate about it?
But it's hard to do visual.
It is. Take something visual into words. So we've moved into the area of free press. And I would
self-censorship.
And self-censorship. But let me pose the general question, and again, maybe we'll start over here and move this way this time. And I think there's
expert on free press,
well, that's okay. But you know what? It's a line to speech. Is the nature of freedom of expression as expressed in a free press, as opposed to the individual? Because the founders did make a distinction. There was a reason they had speech and of the press. Is that crystallizing moment as a publication or a production or a work, is that now gone too far? Do we need to restrain reporting? The nature of it. Do we need to say you can't go live from the scene of a civil disturbance, because that in itself suddenly creates more of the civil disturbance or attracts it or amplifies? Again, this is a technology question in some ways. A professor with the intriguing name of John Watson, no relation to Sherlock, but who was a professor at AU and a lawyer and a journalism professor, said that in his mind, live is no longer news gathering and journalism, it is a marketing tactic. Right. And that we ought to ban it because it causes more harm than good. Well, that's restraint on freedom of the press, but is there a value there that we ought to recognize?
Well, let's...
And please, yeah.
I'm actually going to let Stan go.
Okay,
I've
yeah,
got
sure.
some ideas
Yeah.
percolating,
Okay,
but
well, we'll come back.
You can speak more authoritatively on this issue
what do
than
you
I
think?
certainly can.
Well, I'll give it my best shot. I remember our colleague Steve Bell, who still lives
Right.
here in town. He was with ABC
News.
radio news before he became a television reporter and news anchor and bureau chief with ABC Television News. And let's go back more than 50 years. Let's go back to the 1960s, radio news, ABC radio news, with the Radio On Scene Report, or ROSR as they were called. Before then, radio newscasts were delivered from the studio, of course, own written copy, wire copy, occasional phone reports, and pre-produced tape reports. Well, these were recorded reports as well, the ROSRs that Steve described. And it was the Trenton, New Jersey riots, I believe, if I'm remembering this.
Newark.
Newark, yes, correct, Newark. And Steve was sent out, and he did, if not the first, one of the first, and was getting sound of the actual disturbance to go along with the copy. And of course, Steve Bell is not only one of the finest people you'd ever want to meet, he's one of the finest journalists that has ever practiced in broadcasting. And so he put it in the proper perspective, but there are also layers of editors back in New York handling this. So that was a new dimension. It had the safety, if you will, of tape and not being directly live, because when there's live air, all bets are off. And who can hit the switch, you know, before the profanity or before whatever? You can't unless you are delayed in some fashion. And so, but I see that is where a lot of things started to happen with the ROSR reports.
Yeah.
Maria, did you want to weigh in
Well,
on this?
I was just thinking about an almost live event that I was supposed to cover when I was still working in Texas. It was their second execution, and my students and I were called. It was our number.
To observe. And
Oh, yeah, and to videotape to play back later. There, and I had talked to Mike Capps after the first one, and it's like, no. I really want to keep my number in the pile, but I don't want to be the next one to do this. I think we all have, as journalists, have an obligation to, one, decide what it is that we want our audiences to see, and two, to determine what it is we want to put ourselves through, you know.
yeah, and that's increasingly a problem, by the way, in conflict zones, where journalists are. We're finally recognizing the post-traumatic stress that conflict reporters go through. But you know, this idea of, well, I've asked the question.
Live is indeed a marketing tactic. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
But I would argue, what is elementary? If Watson were here today, what is elementary, my dear Watson?
Well said.
Is that even if television doesn't carry it live, even if news websites don't carry it live, there will be citizens streaming it live on all sorts of social platforms. And the argument I would make is, one of the other things I did was a press secretary for a governor for a while. In the absence of your story, other stories will prevail.
Right.
And if you've got the facts and other people who aren't trained journalists are telling just part of the story, isn't it better to hear it from the pros? That would be my concern.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, the big question is, does the media have the right to presume what the audience can and can't handle? You know, what, you know, can they actually tell us?
And there would be media critics that would say no.
Right.
Who are you?
Yeah.
Right. Tom?
Well,
Show it all.
No, I would go in a completely different direction.
Who would have thought?
No,
No, what direction would you go in?
well,
That begs the
yeah, okay. We started this discussion, and I think it was Phil that brought up the point that the First Amendment restricts government action.
Right.
And I believe, I never talked to James Madison in my life, but I believe the reason for that was the government was the power that existed at the time. And we really have to talk about in the 21st century, are we really talking about a concern about the government restricting free expression, or are we more afraid of corporations and other entities
Google,
restricting free
Facebook,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
Twitter.
And are they the more powerful entities of today? And is it really, does a modernization of the structure require an examination of whether they need to be reined in.
That's a really good question, because there's nothing stopping Twitter and Facebook from developing policies and codes of conduct. They can censor, they can take a post off that's, you know, offensive. But yeah, I think that's the really interesting question is, we know that government can't censor hate speech, but should Facebook and Twitter be doing more or less to censor that kind of speech on those platforms?
We know they should be. People are being killed because of phony stories spread via social media in South Asia. And the social platforms are belatedly taking action on that. Are they moving fast enough, and are they working fast enough in this country? I think most of us would say no, but at least they're moving, which is something that we couldn't say before.
And they're moving into an editorial role when they cross that line, wouldn't you say?
That's right, and that raises another question. They're entitled to, but that changes the stakes, doesn't it?
It does. I remember being on a panel in, I think it was 2010, with some government officials who and some representatives from Google, I think, and I raised the idea that, you know, when electrical companies started, they were just privatized, and you had them run a line to your house from the local power station, and the government wasn't involved. And then we got to the place where electricity became such a necessity, or such an element of our lives, that we now regulate them under sort of a quasi-governmental thing. And I said, what if we were to declare Google and Twitter and Facebook as public utilities that were subject to some form of government regulation? And I said, and this is the First Amendment guy saying this. And of course the government officials fell out. The Google guy just blood drained out of his face. But you know, think about it. Have they become so pervasive in our society that they are now like electric companies, which just can't arbitrarily cut you off, you know, because you missed 10 cents on your bill or whatever it is? They have a procedure they have to follow. We regulate them even though they're private companies. Is Google and Twitter and Facebook and all of those become so essential that they actually now demand regulation, even though they're not the government, because they're just as powerful or just as important in our lives?
Well, and certainly we see our legislators asking questions like that. When we look at you know, the leaders of organizations like Google and Facebook being brought to Capitol Hill to testify in hearings, the thing that makes me really nervous about that, however, is what became quite apparent is the legislators were very ill-informed about the nature of the technology.
Yeah.
So now if these are the individuals who are writing policy, that makes me
for lobbyists.
well, but not just lobbyists,
Or
but
law
also
clerk-
a
or law clerks
situation
also,
where
yeah,
that
yeah.
policy writing is simply turned over to the industry, right? And then we just have
Yeah.
an even muddier.
Sort of famously,
Yeah.
the lore about the Supreme Court when they've ruled on telecommunications is that up until now, we actually haven't had the 9 justices rule. We've had 9 law clerks who have essentially set the policy, because the justices are still referring to that internet thing, because they just aren't quite there yet. I wanted to ask and invite students, if you would, have a question for our panel or a viewpoint that you just simply want to express. If you could sort of begin to line up at a microphone here, if you have one. If not, we'll continue a discussion here in the panel. You could feel free to pose a question to any member of the panel, or to simply state a particular point of view. I would ask that you give us some identifier if you belong to an interest group or something, you speak from that point of view, or your year or major, just to help the context of those of us watching and those watching the program later, to have some idea behind where your question comes from. So I invite you to come up to that mic. And let me ask just a question while that might be going on. Again, having to do with the nature of media today. What we're seeing is maybe a reconcentration of media into fewer and fewer hands.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, and again, is that something that government needs to step into? They're actually deregulated in terms of television ownership, but is that happening so fast now and at such a pace? And the nature of the number of journalism operations decreasing at the same time ownership of what's left is increasing. Do we need to step in and regulate that? Is that, you know, and again, does that open the door to further government control of what we see through media?
What would we want to do? Would we want to increase diversity of ownership? Which that would be fabulous,
Yeah.
but I don't know how you get that genie back into the bottle, so to speak. I don't know that. What seems to be happening, which is every bit as scary to me, is the thinning out of the newsrooms.
Yeah.
Whether it's print or broadcast, there are fewer brains on the copy, fewer eyeballs on the copy before it hits air or before it hits print.
And fewer feet on the street.
Fewer feet on the street. And that makes, I would like to think that there would be some improvement there at some point, but I can also imagine that there are any number of politicians rubbing their hands at, oh, we have fewer gatekeepers now. What can we get by with?
Yeah,
Not
that
all.
makes me very fearful, especially for local news, because I think just the mere presence of a reporter sitting in a city council meeting is enough to keep city government on their toes. And we all also know that voting behaviors and civic engagement, they tend to decrease after a local paper shutters. So those are really important reasons why local media is so important and still really relevant. So
That local media provides the kind of the information processing faculty for local voters who want to know about the issues, who prize being informed about the issues. It provides a mechanism for citizens to engage in advocacy through comments, letters to the editor, editorials, and I mean the impact on democracy with the loss of local journalists is tremendous.
We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Katie Grisey, and I'm a senior journalism student here, and my question's for anyone on the panel. So a few of you discussed the idea, instead of censoring hate speech, being able to address and challenge it, and today when people might call anything they don't like fake news, how do you suggest journalists go about challenging that hatred?
I think it's such a big question, and there are so many different ways to approach that. So, for example, are there certain platforms that encourage it? There has been a great deal of shaming through social media that certain platforms are built to accommodate. I'll call it the way it is. I mean, I believe that Twitter makes it possible because you can contact people with whom you have no contact previously. By use of threaded hashtags, you can get involved in conversations with people who you've never met, who you lack all context with. And so, at any rate, I think that there are a whole bunch of different levels on which this is operating. One, the platform itself. What are platforms doing? I do think there are steps. For example, I recently read that one social media platform is going to make it impossible to forward messages to more than 5 or 10 people at a time. So you can't send it out to thousands of people at once. And I think that that's an example of how technology can be used to limit some of this.
As I think about it from the perspective of a journalist, which is the ground from which that question originated, I think the skills of a journalist to engage in fact-finding, which can be used then to counter the mythos, the lies, the fabrications, the stereotypes that often are embedded in hate speech, becomes particularly important. I think the role of a journalist to engage in perspective taking, to be able to tell a story from multiple perspectives as part of their craft becomes important in countering hate speech, particularly hate speech that is very propagandistic in its nature. And so those would be two things that I would put together in response to that question.
Yes, I think you should get extra credit for that question, by the way. And I think as journalists, as practicing journalists, what we need to do is when that stuff comes in, those charges of fake news and so forth, you just point your journalistic ship right out into that wind and keep going. You don't want to stop. You keep telling the truth as best you know it, balance it, and don't stop. Because that's precisely what those folks, whoever they are, want you to do. The term gaslighting, and this is where I would defer to my friend here, gaslighting has become the new national pastime. And that's where, let's say, a politician, but any one of us could do this. You tell lies. You deny saying something right after you said it. And this, there's a wonderful list. There's an article in Psychology Today, which I would commend to your reading, from Stephanie Sarkis, PhD. And she has a long list of gaslighting terms. So we, in journalism, we've always had to confront lies. But like, the ceiling has been blown off, it seems, especially in D.C. So just keep going. Just keep telling the truth. And as individual citizens, be honest. You know, take a step back. Let's all count to 10. You know, when somebody assails us verbally or whatever, you know, take a pause. Are they feeling well today? What's wrong? You know,
Or before we retreat.
before we retreat.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And I was going to,
Go ahead.
Please.
I'll
age
carry
before
on. Go
beauty.
ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say I address it from the position of being a teacher. In my media criticism classes, we look at known fake news sites, and we also, from time to time, will take a story where we may have an individual of notoriety who says something just didn't happen, or something just wasn't said. So we go back and play all the times those things were said, or we have video of those things happening, and then compare them to what we're hearing. And constantly we're reminding our students to think. Don't just take something at face value or what somebody else said or what you saw. Dig deeper. And so whether you're in journalism or production, you still should think about what's before you.
So for the journalism students in the audience and your friends, all of whom I trust want to find jobs in your field once you get out of here, let's find some good news since there's been so much of the bad. The incident in front of the Lincoln Memorial the other day with 3 groups of people, varying descriptions of what happened, video posted on social media that told only part of the story. It is being suggested that things like that, once people figure out, hey, my first impression was wrong, I was relying on the wrong places for information, that incidents like that may actually drive people back to professional journalism, because your job, our jobs, have been to seek the truth and report it fairly and independently. And I think that's we're actually seeing a market being created by the very people who are trying to sow distrust for their own reasons.
And just to sort of go off of what Don was saying, I read an interesting New York Times column urging journalists to tweet less. And basically it said, you know, post less, lurk more. So be a better listener
Very
and
Hamiltonian.
think
Yes.
critically about
Play,
what
yeah.
that tweet is going to do to that news coverage and do to that conversation. So, I mean, that's not going to happen. Journalists love tweeting, but something to think about, I think.
Well, we've come unfortunately to the end of our hour. I want to thank the panel and those students who are here in the audience who joined in either to listen or contribute to us. These town hall meetings will go on around the country. They will be packaged and available. If you're watching this one, you've already seen it, but there will be additional videos posted on freedomforuminstitute.org. This program will culminate, we hope, in a variety of views from around the country on the future of free speech and freedom of the press. We'll hope you engage in that debate in your own communities with the people you know or teach or preach to or that you interact with. These are essential questions on the future of our democracy. And again, we have complicated those discussions with new technology and what is sometimes seen as disruptive technology, at least in the terms we often talk to each other and to which we receive and gather news and information. Again, thank you for joining us for this, and we hope that you'll come to the website at First Amendment, strike that at freedomforuminstitute.org to find the range of town hall meetings as we move through these programs in 2019. Thank you for joining us, and we're coming to you from Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And we want to thank the faculty from the College of Communication, Information, and Media for joining us today. thank you very much for joining us, and tune in again, as they say.